things differently.
After years of rumors, hints, teases, petitioning, multiple Vero posts, and at times open threats, I have at last borne witness to the Snyder Cut. And it's fine, I guess. Look, the journey that ultimately led us to the release of this movie has been a complicated one, to say the least, and I won't bother getting into the details, but the gist of it is, after the release of 2017's Justice League, there was a general sense of disappointment among the fans and critics as well. And not too long after that, fans started petitioning for the Snyder Cut, a mythical alternate version of the movie that they believed was locked away in a vault in Warner Brothers Studios somewhere. And for the longest time, I didn't believe that it existed. I was wrong about that. And even if it did exist, I said it was never going to be made. I was wrong about that. So now, here we are, reviewing the Snyder Cut. And the biggest question on everyone's mind is it an improvement over the 2017 theatrical release? And the answer to that is yes, it is, but that's an extremely low bar to clear. I don't think that Zack Snyder's Justice League, when you analyze it as a film itself, is very good. It has a lot of flaws, and it's a movie that I did not particularly enjoy watching. Make no mistake, Zack Snyder's Justice League makes much more sense than the 2017 theatrical cut. In fact, this movie is able to tell a coherent story, and it was only by watching this cut of the film that I was able to realize how nonsensical the theatrical version was. The first hour and a half or so of Zack Snyder's Justice League is able to set up the plot of the film much better than the theatrical cut was able to do so. And I think part of the reason that I was able to just kind of go along with the theatrical cut is because I have a pre-existing knowledge of DC Comics, Darkseid, the New Gods, the Fourth World, Steppenwolf, the Mother Boxes. At least on a conceptual level, I knew what all of those things were, so I was along for the ride. But watching Zack Snyder's Justice League made it very apparent how confusing that theatrical version must have been to general audiences. And that is perhaps the biggest compliment that I can pay this movie, is that it tells a much more coherent story. It's very clear what the movie is about, and it is unabashedly Zack Snyder. It is 100% his film, and I will say that is the one thing that I can appreciate about this. Zack Snyder's Justice League is the complete realization of the vision that he laid out for the DC Extended Universe that he started in 2013 with Man of Steel. Unfortunately, that is mostly where the compliments stop, because Zack Snyder's Justice League is an agonizing watch. It is a 4-hour and 2-minute movie, and this is just too long. I think what perplexed me the most while I was watching this film is, considering there is so much new footage in this movie, it's kind of jarring how little the movie actually expands the story in terms of advancing the plot. And as someone who usually likes slow films, I found this movie incredibly boring. And don't get me wrong, long run times do not bother me. Avengers Endgame flew by, and not in a good way. There were so many moments in that movie that I really wish Marvel Feige and the Russo brothers just let those scenes breathe, allow us to feel the emotion of certain things that happened. But the movie was so focused on moving the plot along and getting to the next big set piece, the next big story beat, that it didn't really allow for any meaningful introspection when it came to the narrative or characters. Zack Snyder's Justice League does the opposite of this, but I think it's to the movie's detriment, because this movie feels surprisingly familiar despite being a very different movie from the theatrical cut. And because of this, we know where the movie is going, but it takes an excruciating amount of time to get there. And rather than the narrative being propelled forward in Zack Snyder's Justice League, the narrative is expanded horizontally, which feels incredibly laborious. Yes, characters like The Flash, Aquaman, and especially Cyborg are given more character development and something resembling an arc, but the problem is, at least specifically for Aquaman, a lot of these additional scenes are intended to set up solo films, and we have already seen Aquaman, so these scenes feel superfluous. I would say that there is maybe one scene with Aquaman that gives his character some added context as it relates to the story of Justice League itself. The remainder of his scenes, at least in the first half of the movie, all serve to set up Aquaman, a film that we have already watched and therefore don't need the context for. Flash is also given additional scenes, and I think one of the best scenes in the movie is when he goes to visit his dad, Henry Allen, in prison, because this actually gives his character some weight. It gives his character more to chew on, more nuance, but the remainder of the additional Flash scenes are all extremely pointless. And there's one scene in particular that many people were excited for, where he saves Iris West, played by Kiersey Clemons, who was only in the movie for this one scene, by the way. This sequence unfolds in super Zack Snyder slow motion, and it is the most self-indulgent thing I've ever seen, not just because of the slow motion and the over-dramatic musical cue, but because there is just the weirdest moment during the sequence where the Flash pockets a hot dog. And yes, I understand that it's paid off a few minutes later in the next scene, but it is just an extremely weird thing to watch. And it's scenes like this and other scenes such as Diana learning how to make tea, because Alfred knows how to make tea properly because he's British, I guess, or because he's a butler. There are so many scenes that could have been left on the cutting room floor. There was easily a 3-hour movie in this thing. Easily. And I think if this movie had been 3 hours, if the narrative was more streamlined, I probably would have enjoyed it a lot more. But because of the 4-hour running time, and because of these scenes that feel completely useless, I found myself going insane. The amount of mental gymnastics it took for me to finish the movie was not good, to say the least. I found myself incredibly frustrated. This movie is so poorly paced, and I understand why these scenes are here. Zack and company are trying to give these characters more dimensionality, and I understand that they want to provide more humanity to these characters, and I understand that as well, and I think that's great. But the problem is these scenes don't actually do that, because as this movie unfolds, these scenes aren't actually building to anything, and there's also this really strange conflict going on within the movie where a scene either takes place at an extremely sad and somber 1, or it operates at an absolutely chaotic and kinetic 10. There is no in-between. So these scenes they either operate at the lowest level of importance in terms of cinematic language, or they operate at the highest level of importance. But regardless of what's happening on screen, the way everything is framed, the way everything is shot, tells us, the audience, that everything is of the utmost importance, because everything is heightened. Zack really brings this sense of grandeur and operatic feeling to this movie, and I understand that's what he was going for. He wanted to make a Greek tragedy with superheroes, but the problem is, when everything's important in your movie, nothing's important. As expected, Zack Snyder's Justice League makes a return to the absolutely lugubrious and funereal tone that was seen in Batman v Superman, Dawn of Justice, and Man of Steel. This movie is darker than the theatrical cut, but it's not as dark as Batman v Superman. It is not oppressively dark in the sense that it's not constantly beating you over the head and telling you how sad you should feel. That said, this cut of Justice League is extremely serious. This is a serious movie, guys. This is full of serious people saying serious stuff. There is a scene where Icelandic villagers break into a folk song in their native tongue, as if they were just ripped from Ari Aster's Midsummer, as Aquaman descends into the sea, shedding articles of clothing. And as they're still singing, one of the women picks up his sweatshirt and smells it. This is serious stuff. In all seriousness, it's this kind of tone and this kind of attitude that makes it really hard to connect with these movies. Because while it is extremely clear that Snyder is very passionate about this film, and his care and love for these characters is palpable, they're not being presented as the way that we know them. These are very much the characters as Zack Snyder views them. This is his personal take on them. That's how it's always been, and that's how it continues in this movie. But the problem is, this is a Justice League movie. One would think that a Justice League movie would at the very least be fun. It's not. Justice League is not a movie that's meant to be enjoyed. It's a movie that's meant to be consumed, mainlined, all at once or nothing at all, because that is how Zack Snyder, and by extension his fan base, operates. This movie takes itself so damn seriously in the first half, and so much of it is so self-indulgent that it's hard to take it seriously. It's too serious to be taken seriously. That is the best way I can put it. And of course, because this movie is 100% Zack Snyder, the movie is so desaturated to the point where the image is so washed out, the color palette looks monochromatic. I mean, I have talked about Zack Snyder's affinity for a washed out color palette before, but in this movie, for whatever reason, it was much, much more obvious. As I said, there were scenes that almost looked monochromatic. The movie's so gray and so dark. The skin textures are just so weird. Wonder Woman looks like her skin tone resembles a corpse. And it's really strange, because the problem with this level of desaturation, although it adds to the tone and the mood and aesthetic that Zack Snyder is going for, it deprives the cinematography of having any meaningful layers of texture within the environment surrounding the characters. And this tone, to a larger extent, obviously spreads to the characters, as it seems like acting was not a priority in this movie, because I just got the impression that everybody was having a contest to see who could look the most grim-faced. Affleck is still doing the thing, Ray Fisher's doing the thing. You know, everybody's just trying to out-serious one another. And the only person in this movie that I felt like was truly acting was Joe Morton as Silas Stone and Billy Crudup as Henry Allen. Those were the only two performers in the film that looked as if they've acted in a motion picture before. Otherwise, everyone else is reciting the goofiest dialogue I have ever heard. There are some lines in this movie that no human being would ever say. Not even a superpowered god. I'm sorry. It sounds ridiculous. I mean, the sequence on Themyscira, when Steppenwolf first shows up, and Hippolyta's like, Amazons, show him your fear. We have no fear. The way that's delivered, and just kind of the cadence that they give it, is so weird. I mean, it's laughable. And that also makes it hard for me to take this movie seriously when it so desperately wants to be taken seriously. And then you have performances like Ben Affleck's sedated Bruce Wayne. This dude is walking through this performance for the entire movie. In a 4-hour movie, he just completely puts it in autopilot. I mean, Ambi and Affleck here. I don't understand what he was going for, but that is the worst big screen portrayal of Batman that I've ever seen. And I really, really disliked his Batman in Batman v Superman. But Jesus Christ, his Batman in this is terrible. Is it a no wonder he murdered people in Batman v Superman? He's useless in this movie. Like, he can't get anything done unless he's killing people. Oh my god. Okay, I apologize. We're getting a little bit derailed here. But the performances are just, they're not really there. There are two actors, as I said, in the movie who really feel like they're performing. And again, circling back to the beginning, a lot of these characters are given additional context, but I don't think it actually gives them humanity or real depth, because Cyborg, Aquaman, and Flash are all undergoing the same journey thematically. It is an Ayn Randian wet dream. Everyone in this movie is struggling with how special and powerful they are. And the conflict they're having is they don't want to admit how special and powerful they are. Or everyone else in the world just doesn't realize how special and powerful they are. I'm just so tired of this Ayn Randian bullshit in these movies. Cyborg is the closest thing that this movie has to a main character, and his interactions with his dad, while at times they can be heartfelt, the crux of this just evokes so much shades of John Galt from Atlas Shrugged that it's hard not to view this movie with Zack Snyder's personal lens of that objectivist philosophy being imbued within these characters. And I've never liked that. It's an interesting idea in theory, but I don't think you can do that when you never really constructed these characters to begin with. And so it's still really hard to connect with any of these characters, despite the fact that this movie is strangely meditative. It's slow. It tries to be more human than Zack Snyder's previous two entries into the DCEU, but it doesn't succeed because of the way that they're written. And the performances really don't help because they're all just so grim and wooden. And one of the characters, too, that really benefited from this extended cut is the villain Steppenwolf. And he was much maligned in the 2017 theatrical cut, and for good reason, but he's not any better in this movie. Yes, he has a backstory. Yes, he has real motivation, but he's still horribly pathetic. This guy is just a middle management lackey for Darkseid and Apocalypse. It's sad, honestly. There are moments in the movie where I genuinely feel bad for Steppenwolf because of how pathetic he is. I mean, yeah, technically he's given more character, but it's just nothing meaningful, and that pretty much sums up this movie. This movie is the same movie in terms of the plot and the narrative, while somehow being twice as long, and it gives you very little to work with. I mean, there's not a lot there, and it's really kind of confusing, and I think that is also part of the reason that I found this to be such a frustrating watch, because there is so much new footage and added context to this movie, and as I said, it does flesh out the story. It's more coherent. There's more connective tissue. But it's still shockingly familiar. Zack Snyder has always been an extremely visual filmmaker. And the things that I've praised Zack Snyder for in the past, his eye for framing and staging a scene, and specifically action, he delivers sometimes in this movie. And I will say that even though there is an extreme excess of slow motion in this movie, when it's done well, because it's so overused in this movie, it's hard to fully appreciate it, but when it is done well, Zack Snyder's slow-mo tableau style of filmmaking is pretty visually striking in this movie. There is a really fantastic group shot of the Justice League in the final act of the film that it was one of the very few moments in the movie that got me to cheer, because it was a really cool image. And this idea of wanting to create frames that essentially act as moving Renaissance paintings is dazzling when it pays off. There's another shot in the final act of the movie with Wonder Woman and Steppenwolf, and it's kind of the same thing. It's beautiful. It's a really beautiful image. And I will say that, you know, he didn't necessarily deliver to the extent that I was hoping for, but when he does deliver in this movie, it is truly dazzling. Zack Snyder has an enviable skill for creating fascinating images. And the biggest compliment, too, I will say, in regards to this cut over the theatrical cut, is the third act is much, much better. It's, by and large, the most improved aspect of the film. It is much better. The action sequences are much easier to follow. They're just generally more engaging, and I think it's just more exciting as a whole. Maybe because the movie up until that point had been so long that when you get to the final act, you're really excited. But I do think the final act contains some genuinely fantastic comic book movie moments. There is a moment with Flash in this movie that, in my opinion, is without a doubt one of the best visual realizations of a superhero power on screen. It gave me chills, and again, it was one of the few moments in this movie where not only was I cheering, but I thought for a second, holy shit, Zack Snyder understands what the Justice League is supposed to be about. That moment with Flash fully realizing his powers and using them in a way that's not only visually interesting for film, but really purposeful in terms of the narrative and the action. It's such a great realization of the character of Flash in terms of his superpowers and using them for narrative purpose and not just a cool visual. It was absolutely phenomenal. But these moments are so few and far between, and the biggest problem here is Justice League would be so much better if it just cut out that god-awful epilogue. What the hell was that? The last 45 minutes or so of this movie are so tacked on and just bad. I mean, it's a continuation of the nightmare sequence from Batman v Superman, which was the worst part about that very bad movie. But this epilogue in Zack Snyder's Justice League feels so out of place and really self-indulgent, like the first half, but for different reasons, because this epilogue is setting up sequels that might not happen. I won't say it's impossible, because I was wrong about this whole thing to begin with, but I will say it's probably unlikely. And that's essentially what this thing is doing. This epilogue is setting up sequels while just being ugly to look at and a really try-hard, edgy thing. This interaction with Batman and Jared Leto's terrible Joker is so corny. I mean, Batman threatens to kill the Joker and he drops an F-bomb. That is the corniest thing I've ever seen. It's such an attempt to be edgelord and gritty, but Batman saying the F word and using it to threaten somebody, that doesn't make him more threatening. That makes him less threatening. That scene made me laugh when I saw it. It felt like a 13-year-old kid wrote that. And I just can't figure out why Zack just can't really resist going there at times. Because there are moments in this movie, as I said, especially during the final act, where it seems like he has it figured out. But he just can't resist going back to the place that he's so familiar with. And that is Zack Snyder's Justice League in a nutshell. It's too long. There was easily a 3-hour movie in here. And if it was condensed and the narrative was more streamlined, I think I would have enjoyed this movie a lot more than I did. I am inclined to say that this is Zack Snyder's best DC movie, but the other two were so bad that it's a really low bar to clear. I think this movie is a really good example of how much editing and color grading can affect a film. If you compare this to the 2017 theatrical cut, it is really quite astonishing, and I think it really could be used as a case study in film school about how important these post-production processes are to the filmmaking process. Look, this movie wasn't for me. Zack Snyder's take on the DC characters, his DCEU, it's never been for me. But I went into this, I wouldn't say excited, but I went into this on the optimistic side because I had read and watched some reviews from critics that I really trust and generally agree with say that this was a good movie. So I guess in a way I was excited, and I do have people that can confirm that because I know that there are going to be those who say, I just hate Snyder, therefore I hate the movie. That's not true. I was excited to watch this. I looked forward to it all week, the week of its release, and I was erring on the side of optimism. But somehow, even though I knew exactly what to expect, this movie disappointed me. And it's because of that reason that I'm ultimately left with the decision that unless you are a Zack Snyder superfan or heavily invested in the DC Extended Universe, I cannot recommend this movie to you. Save 1/6 of your day. Because if you're not a fan, it's just going to drive you insane with the terrible pacing, the really confusing scene composition, and ultimately really drawing out the film. But of course it was always going to be this way because of the campaign that led us here. It was full of harassment and bullying and toxicity. And his fandom was rewarded for that. And as a result, this movie was always going to be all or nothing. It was either going to be so Zack Snyder or nothing. And it was 100% Zack Snyder. And I respect that he was able to finish this movie and see his creative vision through. But as its own movie, this is not a good movie. Zack Snyder's Justice League, while still quite bad, is shockingly familiar despite having so much added new context to this movie. And it's not an experience that I'm likely to revisit. I don't know what else to say. This was a really confusing movie for me, and I will be making a spoiler discussion review about this film because I tried to keep this spoiler free, although if you did watch the theatrical cut, you more or less have a pretty good idea of how the plot turns out. But there was just so much in this movie that left me scratching my head. There is a lot of narrative heavy lifting, but it's not actually propelling the story forward. It's not building to anything, like I said. It's just sort of expanding the story mythologically. And I think that was a really strange phenomenon to witness, and it really made the viewing weaker than I think it would have been if the movie was more condensed. Because I think there is a 3-hour movie in here that is 100% Zack Snyder's film, but also much more concise. And I really, really believe I would have liked that movie a lot more. There are things in here that are introduced and just never touched on again. There's a subplot about poverty and homelessness, and they address it with Cyborg, and then they just never come back to it. It's little things like that that make this movie seem all over the place, unfocused. It's still messy. It is operatic, it's long, but it's still a mess. And that has basically been Zack Snyder's tenure with DC. Thank you for watching, everybody. I hope you all have a good night. Stay safe, be well. Hopefully we come out of this soon, and may your heart be your guiding key.